No part of this recording may be used to train so-called generative AI models. Alex Krycek came through the back window, creeping through the darkened rooms and wondering at the silence. It was only a little after midnight. Surely he wasn't asleep already. He moved like a shadow through the hallway, coming up beside the couch and peering into the shadows. The television was off. The couch was empty. And Alex was completely confused. Where the hell was Mulder? Backtracking through the quiet hallway, he leaned his shoulders around the doorway to the bedroom and froze with surprise. Mulder was asleep, in his bed, not on the couch. The sheets were draped smoothly across his legs, not tangled from some nameless nightmare. He looked peaceful. Krycek stared at him for a long moment, then holstered his weapon. He'd never seen Mulder like this, so relaxed. His hair was ruffled, a few dark locks falling over his forehead, making him look boyish. His mouth was slightly open, his parted lips surprising Krycek. His mouth looked so inviting. Unaware of his actions, Krycek moved closer, staring at the figure sprawled on the bed. He was nude. The fact suddenly hit Alex with the force of a freight train, and he found his breath coming faster. His eyes widened slightly, and he drank in the details. He'd been Mulder's partner for such a short time, only a few months. He'd known he was attractive, but it had been secondary to his actual mission, just as it should be tonight. But for some reason, his body wasn't paying any attention to all of his mind's shoulds. This was an excerpt from the first known Mulder/Krycek fanfiction, authored by one Brenda Antrim, and aptly titled Krycek, with an H. Welcome to another episode of Fandom X Archive, where we explore the early history of the X-Files fandom. I'm your host, Dinara Tengri, aka Alien Super Soldier, and I have a very delicious episode for you this month. As you might have guessed from the intro, this episode we're doing a deep dive into one of the most popular X-Files ships, namely Mulder/Krycek, or MKR, as it's been efficiently dubbed by the fans. Full disclosure, MKR is my all-time favorite ship, so if it's an unbiased, objective, and thoroughly clinical breakdown you're expecting, you're about to be very disappointed. Before we commence with the episode proper, a content warning. We're going to be touching on such subjects as intimate partner violence, abusive relationships, rape, and non-con as it pertains to the works of fanfiction. We're also going to discuss themes and motifs of homoerotic and sexual nature. I am not a therapist, nor am I an expert on any of the above-mentioned topics, and I have tried to approach these topics with care and forethought. We're also going to touch on homophobia and inclusivity in fan spaces. With that out of the way, let's get into this. Part 1. A brief history of MKR. To tell the story of MKR, we need to start at the very beginning, on January 21st, 1994. That was when the episode Genderbender premiered. It is considered to be one of the worst in the series, and for a good reason, as it played on and perpetuated the trope, however unintentionally, of transgender characters as duplicitous and predatory. Genderbender nonetheless proved to be crucial for the series, as that was the episode in which a young actor by the name of Nicholas Lee was cast as one of the gender-bending aliens' victims. In the 1996 interview with the TV Zone, Lee had said that, quote, "I had a guest star role there with about 3 scenes, so they really liked what I'd done, or so they told me, which was nice. And when the time came to cast the role of Krycek, they read about 30 actors in LA, and I was about the only one they read in Vancouver, and I got the part that afternoon." End quote. When asked why he thought the producers chose him, he had said that, quote, "I would say it's got something to do with there's a little bit of darkness to the way I look. That's what they were looking for. somebody who could look like an inexperienced FBI agent fresh out of the academy, and somebody who could add a bit of darkness to the look of the character. We owe Lee's casting to Rob Bowman, who directed both Genderbender and Sleepless, Krycek's debut episode, and who was so impressed with Lee's acting that he recommended him for the role of the duplicitous Krycek. Nick was the best of all. He earned that role. He beat out everybody else, Bowman said reportedly. If we have Bowman to thank for casting Nick Lee as Krycek, we have the actor himself to thank for a lot of the characteristics and subtleties of the character going forward. Lee had said many times that he imbued his portrayal with traits and mannerisms that he thought would be in character for Alex Krycek, the double agent, to make him more human and add to that inherent ambiguity. And since the character was given no backstory, Lee would work out his own background for Krycek to inform both the character's choices and his own. In the 1995 interview with Cinefantastique, Lee had said that, quote, "I felt right from the beginning that Krycek was a guy who is really good at what he does. He's aggressive. He had a lot to prove to himself and to the people in his past. He was really just following orders. He was just trying to do his job the best he saw fit. In Ascension, the last scene I had with a cigarette-smoking man, we were in a car together, and I was saying, 'Listen, I don't know if what I'm doing is right.' And he said, 'Just do it, because you do what we tell you to do.' Krycek is just a guy who's just maybe a little overzealous and doing what he was told to do, following orders, doing his job." End quote. The reason we're starting our MKR history lesson with the casting of Nick Lee as Alex Krycek is because I believe that had a different actor been cast in this role, there wouldn't be any MKR to speak of. Writing matters, direction matters, but whether or not a ship will sink or float is a question of chemistry between the two actors portraying the characters in question. In other words, it's the fans, not the writers, who create ships. And it's that ineffable something that happens when two actors are on screen together, the choices they make when they play off of each other, that us fans immediately notice and are drawn to. From there, we just let our imagination take over. And it's not a controversial thing to say that David Duchovny and Nicholas Lee have that on-screen chemistry in spades. And fans were quick to peg Mulder and Krycek as one of the leading gay ships on the X-Files, the other being Mulder and Skinner. In fact, according to fan lore, the first known Mulder and Skinner fanfic predates the first known Mulder and Krycek fanfic, but we'll cover that ship in another episode. I have read somewhere, might have been on fan lore, that during the first season of The X-Files, some fans were complaining over the lack of slashable characters on the show. Well, all that changed when a plucky young FBI agent, allegedly named Alex Krycek, first offered his hand and a smile to a very unamused Fox Mulder in the Season 2 episode Sleepless. As Mulder and Krycek's relationship progressed and changed throughout the seasons, so did their ship grow, change, and transform the ecosystem not just of the X-Files fandom, but the online fandoms as a whole. This may be anecdotal evidence, but I have since seen a lot of the tropes and themes that have had their origin in the MKR fandom adopted by and given new life in other Slash fandoms, primarily those concerned with motifs of enemies to lovers, deception, and redemption. According to fan lore, MKR was one of the biggest Slash ships on the net, something that I can confirm, as this was one of the biggest ships I have encountered when I joined the online fandom in 2009. For my own part, I can't remember what came first, the chicken or the egg. That is, if I started shipping Mulder and Krycek first and discovered like-minded, irredeemable souls online later, or if it was the other way around. Suffice it to say that since 2009, I have shipped many a pairing in different media, both gay and straight, but Mulder and Krycek have been my flagship through it all. We know, of course, that what made the X-Files fandom so revolutionary was that its emergence and development went hand in hand with this curious new technology called the Internet. It was the new frontier that had transformed not just the interaction within the fandoms, but between the fandoms and the creators. And it's not far-fetched to say that the people of the X-Files were at least somewhat aware of the fact that a lot of the fans wanted to see Mulder and Krycek get together. At least, both of the actors portraying the two halves of this cursed ship were made aware of its existence. In an interview with the New York Times in 2015, When asked if he knew about saucy MSR fanfiction, David Duchovny had said, quote, X-Files was kind of in its heyday. That was the beginning of the internet. I was very skeptical and thought this thing will never last. My favorite was the fanfiction that had Alex Krycek, my nemesis, and me as lovers. It was beautiful. End quote. As for Nicholas Lee, the story goes that he had in fact read the first MKR story and liked it. For the record, when my former MKR writing partner and me first met Nicholas Lee at the X-Files Museum in 2022, we did give him a copy of one of our stories, the tamest one, obviously. But when I got to meet him again at FileFest, I just didn't have the guts to ask him if he'd read it. Oh well. As any self-respecting ship, MKR was being kept alive and thriving by fans making fan videos, or vidding in nerd speak, making fan art, and writing fan fiction and other text like essays and shipper manifestos. As much as I'd love to dive into the saucy world of MKR fan art and fan videos, this script is already turning out to be longer than I intended, and since fan fiction is what I know best, fan fiction is what we're going to explore in this episode. Before the emergence of social media platforms, or as I like to call it, the good old days, fan works were mainly distributed and archived on fan sites and fanfiction archives, which were hosted and run by passionate fans with time to spare. For MKR, one of the earliest known archives was MKRA, the Mulder and Krycek Romantics Association, an interactive multimedia website. This sounds so 90s, I cry a little every time I read this sentence. Whose tagline was, "For those who know real UST when they see it." Yes, this was a dig at MSR. A cursory browse will tell you a story of an active fandom that organized zine exchanges, contests, and had a whole page dedicated to The Kiss from the Season 5 episode The Red and the Black. According to fan lore, MKRA was owned by the Girls Who Like Boys Who Do Boys Club Incorporated, which also owned the Mulder and Skinner Society, among other fan sites. Chronologically, MKRA was the predecessor to TER/MA, or Truly Erotic Rad Boy/Mulder Association, and the Rat B fanfiction archives. Alas, we don't have the time to go over every fanfic archive and fan site dedicated to MKR, and I highly recommend you go to Fanlore and browse through the catalog for yourselves. Not only do I get a pang of nostalgia when I visit those sites, those that are still up, that is, but it makes me sad that that era of the internet fandom is gone. I'm thinking about all the work and creativity that went into creating and maintaining those sites. I'm thinking about the ecosystems that have evolved around those projects that ran on nothing but passion and a sense of community. The X-Files fandom is still alive and thriving, but since most of it exists on social media platforms, the nature of the fandom is determined for the most part by the rules and algorithms that rule these platforms. Fans still write fanfiction and create beautiful fan art, but the so-called engagement and interaction with other fans is predetermined by the rules of the platforms and streamlined to fit into these molds. And the result? Not only is a lot of the so-called content derivative and unoriginal, but the fandom itself, the kind of interactions and discussions we are allowed to have, is no longer prescribed by any internal rules that we create for ourselves, but by the billionaires who own these platforms. We absolutely need to come back to this discussion in a future episode. My point here is that I really miss that, to borrow a phrase from YouTuber Jenny Nicholson, scrappy and DIY spirit of innovation and exploration that was found on those early fan sites and fanfiction archives. Not just MKR, but the X-Files fandom in general. Part 2. Themes and Tropes in MKR Fanfiction. Chapter 1. Subtext is slowly becoming text. In their thesis, How Does Postmodernist Theory Inform Our Reading of Mulder and Krycek/Fiction, Jedrzej M. Duzinski writes that, quote, in Mulder and Krycek/Fiction, this process is evident in the discussion of the unresolved sexual tension, or UST, between the two characters. Fans genuinely feel that they have perceived a sexual dimension to the Mulder and Krycek relationship, even if the creators were not willing to recognize it. End quote. I'd go even further and argue that in a relationship like Mulder and Krycek's, in a fictional universe filled with secrets, conspiracies, and moral ambiguity, there already is an implicit sexual dimension. The tension and the loaded interactions brought to life by the actors' portrayals and the direction, however unintentionally, at the very least allows for a sexual and romantic interpretation, and at the most implies one. Seen this way, fanfiction and other erotic or romantic fan works simply make explicit what already exists beneath the surface of the TV screen. Or, as a certain sexy librarian on Buffy the Vampire Slayer put it, subtext is rapidly becoming text. And that is what fanfiction, at least to a large part, has always been about. Chapter 2: Addressing the Abusive Relationship. It has been argued by the slasher fandom that the reason Mulder is so physically violent with Krycek is because he's struggling with his own attraction to the man who's allegedly killed his father and betrayed him more times than they can both count, and that the rough physical contact is a way for Mulder to act out his hidden desires in a manner that Mulder deems acceptable. If this is the interpretation that we assume to be canonical in a universe where Mulder and Krycek eventually enter a sexual relationship, then it adds a problematic dimension to that relationship. A lot of fanfiction addresses and deals with this problem to varying degrees of success, while others choose to ignore it completely, while others still fetishize it and lean into it. In fact, a lot of stories that I have read begin with Mulder physically assaulting Krycek until Krycek has enough room to say something that will get Mulder's attention and curiosity. This is, of course, in character for their on-screen relationship, and this is where the slashfic author faces the challenge of dealing with Mulder's dark and abusive side. In their brilliant fanfiction series, The Northwest Passage, a fellow Swedish fanfic author, Torch, addresses the abusive element of Mulder and Krycek's relationship head-on. Spoilers for the second part of the series, titled Lovers. After Mulder and Krycek spend the night together for the first time, Krycek says something that makes Mulder angry, and Mulder raises his hand as if to strike Krycek, but is interrupted by Scully. Notice that, just like on the show, Krycek doesn't make an attempt to retaliate or even shield himself. Later in the story, Mulder and Scully have a long and loaded discussion about Mulder potentially starting a relationship with Krycek, and Scully brings up the risk of Mulder perpetuating this pattern of abuse. It's a tense scene that addresses one of the dark sides of the character we love. But the aim here is not to vilify Mulder, but to give him an opportunity to come to terms with a pattern of behavior he may not have been aware of, and change that. What we know about Mulder on the X-Files is that he's single-minded, compassionate, and fiercely protective of the people he cares about. It's through this protectiveness that Mulder's violent side is allowed to come out, mostly. We're not here to psychoanalyze Mulder and figure out if his violent side is a character flaw or a result of our culture allowing, even demanding, violent behavior in a male character, even one who is otherwise as unburdened by the displays of the traditional Western masculinity as Fox Mulder. But in a fictional universe where Mulder and Krycek do enter an explicitly sexual relationship, the violence Mulder inflicts on Krycek on the show poses a challenge, one that must be addressed and explored. I really admire Torch for making Mulder's abusive pattern explicit and calling a spade, no matter how uncomfortable it made me as a fan of Mulder. As far as abusive relationships go, one can make an argument that Krycek has done so much worse by Mulder, and that all the punches he endures by Mulder's hand are just dessert. And yes, strictly speaking, their on-screen relationship is a mutually abusive one, with Krycek manipulating Mulder, putting his life in peril, and hurting people Mulder loves. But the fact is that most of the instances when Mulder beats up Krycek, the rad boy poses no immediate threat to him and is often in handcuffs, so it's not self-defense, it's abuse. Here, I also need to address the fact that stories featuring rape and dubious consent were popular in this particular fandom. I will not go into detail on this point, mostly because I don't read stories where Mulder rapes Krycek or vice versa. Stories where one or both of these characters face sexual assault by an outsider character are different, since those stories are often found in the hurt/comfort genre, and the assault in those cases often serves a purpose of bringing these characters closer together, We will talk about the hurt/comfort in the next chapter. But I oppose stories that force one or both of these characters to be the rapist, for the simple reason that it's not in character for neither Mulder nor Krycek. The common excuse for the stories that I have come across is that if Krycek is the attacker, it's because he's a villain. And if he's the one being attacked by Mulder, it's just Mulder getting him back for all the bad things he's done to him. I hope I don't need to explain how problematic and faulty that logic is. Coming back to that first MKR story, Krycek, with an H, I have a lot of problems with that one, because of how Krycek takes advantage of the fact that Mulder has suffered amnesia, and the fact that afterwards, having regained his memory, Mulder murders Krycek in cold blood, and the fact that Scully helps him dispose of the body without so much as a passing questioning of her partner's morals. Thankfully, despite being the first known MKR story, Krycek with an H did not end up setting the standard for the genre. Of course, there are a lot of different kinds of MKR fanfiction, and not all of them aim to explore the emotional sides of these characters. Some are just fun, sexy romps, and that's completely fine too. But as far as the emotional, character-driven stories are concerned, a good fanfic author will give both of these characters a chance to atone for the pain they have caused each other, physical and emotional. Chapter 3: Redemption, Discovery, and Hurt/Comfort. Coming back to Duzinski's thesis, they write, in cases of long-form/fiction, much more time is given to mapping out the characters' interior lives, something that is not possible on screen, as the X-Files does not have voiceovers for interior monologues. The writers of fanfiction have a means of exploring the private and emotional lives of Mulder and Krycek, which makes the new interpretations of their sexualities more convincing. End quote. One of the more popular motifs for exploring the characters' inner lives is the hurt/comfort motif, which, put simply, means having one character in the pairing endure some kind of painful event so that the second character can comfort them, and maybe even heal them. As Duzinski puts it, quote, for many hurt/comfort writers, the first step is to open up one of the characters emotionally, to get them to a point where they can be cared for and repaired. And both sides of the equation are just ways of bringing characters together, allowing them to interact with each other emotionally in ways that are not allowed in the universe they were born into. Without being put in these hurt/comfort scenarios, the characters would not have the space in which to respond to each other in a way other than the friend/enemy binaries that are required in order to maintain the narrative superstructure of the source material. Television programs cannot afford characters this kind of liberty, but rather keep them in narrow trajectories. End quote. In a lot of fan fiction I have read, the hurt/comfort component is what allows Mulder to get to know Krycek on a deeper level, which oftentimes is the first step towards forgiving him, and ultimately falling in love with him, or realizing that he's been in love with him this whole time. In the Admission series by Aries, for instance, after their first and tumultuous sexual encounter, Krycek is injured on the job, and Mulder takes him home, giving them both the time and space to discuss their budding relationship. In another post-coital moment, Krycek admits to Mulder that he's been raped as a teenager, a revelation that both shocks Mulder and brings him closer to his new lover. In the Northwest Passage, the story begins with Mulder and Scully helping Krycek solve the case of his parents' deaths. Aside from it being a good mystery, this premise allows Mulder to see his old nemesis in a new light and find the real person underneath the hard, leather-clad surface. And it allows the author to make Krycek vulnerable and open for the comfort that Mulder is now willing to provide. In the span of the series, Torch gives a lot of space for Mulder to react to Krycek having his arm amputated by the Russian insurgents and come to terms with his own role in this mutilation. A curious detail is that both in Admission and in Lovers, the second part of the Northwest Passage, Mulder tells Krycek, "I'm sorry this happened to you." This, to me at least, is the kind of acknowledgement of the other man's pain that the characters could never have on the show. It's validating both for the characters and for the fans of the pairing. What of Krycek? How does the hurt/comfort motif allow him to fall for Mulder? Well, a common theme in the MKR fanfiction, a trope you might say, is that Krycek is already in love with Mulder, and where Mulder has to admit his own feelings for the other man for himself, Krycek's challenge is one of reconciling his feelings with the reality of their relationship and their respective roles in the overarching conspiracy. A lot of the times we find Krycek struggling with his desire to be with Mulder, as he perceives it as selfish. For both characters, the hurt/comfort motif is the catalyst that allows them to atone for the pain they've inflicted on each other and move past the abusive and toxic aspects of their relationship. Coming back to Duzinski's thesis, we can make an argument that by writing fanfiction, by abducting these characters and putting them through the hurt/comfort treatment, fans are giving these characters something that the writers of the source material wouldn't or couldn't do. Quote, "The healing is at the heart of slash fiction. If we take the name itself, slash, there is an implication of breaking something, slashing something, assaulting it in some way. Indeed, breaking into the canon, rupturing it, plundering the characters, and rewriting them lies at the heart of slash fiction projects. It is through slashing that fans can breathe new life into their characters and repair the damage done to them by the mass media." End quote. Part 3. Queer representation on the X-Files and in fanfiction. We have discussed the politics of queering established characters and inclusion of queer and gay fans in fan spaces, or lack of such, ad nauseum in the episode Queer Ships and the Right to Slash Your Favorite Characters, so we're not going too deep into the subject here. However, there are a couple of points we need to at least touch on in an episode that explores a gay pairing in a fictional universe. The first one being the lack of queer representation in the source material, and the second, the alleged female majority in the MKR fandom. Both these points are problematic in their own ways and pose different challenges for the fans of an explicitly gay pairing. Returning to Duzinski's thesis, quote, "The X-Files was surprisingly limited in the range of its characters' sexualities, as well as in the portrayal of their sexual life. Indeed, with the exception of occasional reference to Mulder's predilection for pornography, the writers of the X-Files never portrayed his sexuality in much depth. Added to this lack of depth, the fact that there is a universal lack of non-heterosexual characters in the X-Files seems to indicate that sexuality might have been a taboo for the writers. On the other hand, slash fiction creates a space in which the characters can explore their sexuality in pornographic detail. This is both the hybridization of erotic writing with professional screenwriting and also one of the narrow heteronormative world of the X-Files with a more sexually diverse world." End quote. As I have said in that previous episode, for a show that has purposefully put traditional gender roles on their heads by writing Mulder into a traditionally female archetype and Scully into a traditionally male one, and a show where the writers have done an otherwise good job in exploring gender in a patriarchal structure like the FBI and the military, it is disappointing that so little effort has been made in exploring different sexualities as well. This isn't an indictment of either Chris Carter or the staff writers, but a reflection of the reality and politics of broadcast television of the 1990s. I have read somewhere that Monica Reyes was originally written as a lesbian, but that this concept was dropped, presumably because of fear of backlash from the network and the general public. Then again, the writers did have more freedom to do queer representation right in the 2008 movie and in the revival, but what little representation that does exist in both is, well, not good. Is it this lack of representation that drives some fans to choose to interpret these characters as gay, bi, or pansexual? Well, no. As we have discussed in the beginning of this episode and in the previous one, fans are good at discerning character traits that can be interpreted as queer, regardless of the writer's or the actor's intent. And had the writers written another FBI agent who was openly gay, there is no guarantee that the fans would have responded to them the way we have to Mulder and Krycek, or started shipping them with Mulder or Scully as intensely as we ship Mulder and Krycek or Scully and Reyes. What I am arguing is that the reason these established characters were written as strictly heterosexual, or that their heterosexuality was taken for granted, has at least partly to do with the assumed heteronormative status quo both in our society and in popular culture, at least in the 90s. As Dzinski puts it, quote, "There is nothing about his belief in the paranormal and the desire to uncover government cover-ups that suggests his sexuality has to manifest in a straight relationship. Indeed, it is surprising that a television series that is so capable of thinking outside of the box in terms of its subject matter is so limited in terms of its portrayal of sexuality." End quote. At the same time, both Mulder and Scully weren't written as explicitly sexual characters. Their romantic lives were rarely at the center of the stories. Even their own relationship was, at least until season 7, centered around and governed by that overarching conspiracy. For all the perceived UST, both between Mulder and Scully, Mulder and Krycek, and other characters, The X-Files as a show was not concerned with the characters' romantic and sexual lives, aside from certain storylines. This freedom from the overtly sexual themes is one of the things that allows fans to interpret most of these characters as gay or bisexual. The second point, that is, the assumption that most fans who ship guy-on-guy pairings and write homoerotic fanfiction are women, is more difficult to discuss, as there are no statistics and no facts that we can work from, only assumptions and vibes. In my own experience, most fanfiction, gay and straight, is written by women, but the anonymity that the internet provides makes it nearly impossible to test this theory. But if we accept this assumption as the truth, it does create some problems for the world of slash ships and slash fic, especially if most women who engage with slash are heterosexual themselves, and if at least some of them admit that they engage with slash for their own gratification and have no interest in questions of queer representation in general. Where does the line between admiration and fetishization lie? Then again, there are slash fic authors out there who are queer, gay and bi women, men and non-binary people alike, some of whom are interested in queer representation and exploration of the characters' sexualities beyond the naughty fics. I am by no means trying to vilify straight women who write guy-on-guy slash fic, nor am I arguing that I was more qualified to write slash fic by virtue of being bi. I was still a cis woman writing two male characters in a romantic scenario. What I am saying is that we need to keep having these discussions if we want to create inclusive and diverse fan spaces. I asked my friend Sean, host of the Hey Dan Eats Mulder podcast, to be my beta reader for the script, and we ended up having an interesting conversation about this very topic. To quote Sean, "I wish there was more scholarship on this, because it would be so interesting to have a framework for thinking about this particular genre of slash. What separates the slash that seeks to experience queer representation in the universe from the slash in which an individual is exploring their own sexuality? Erotica is an important and fun exploration of sexuality, but what happens when it ventures into SA?" End quote. This may be as good a time as any to announce that this episode is the first installment in a new series here on Fandom X Archive dedicated to exploring slash ships. It will be titled The Lost Art of Forehead Slash. The title was actually a suggestion by Sean. I chose it because A, it's a reference to one of my favorite X-Files episodes, and B, because I feel like slashing is a lost art in this fandom. While slash ships like Mulder and Krycek or Scully and Reyes still exist, I'm afraid the heyday of slashing is over, with a lot of the most active authors and creators having left the fandom. This series will be a way to keep both the ships and the conversations around them alive and going. Part 4. Thanks and acknowledgements. There was so much more I wanted to cover in this episode, like the Egg Beater Challenge, the Rat Boy vs. Skippy discourse, the different MKR/fic awards, and the drama they inevitably created, as well as the legally dubious world of homoerotic fan art and photo manips. We haven't even discussed the whys, as in, what is it about this forbidden pairing that slash fans find so alluring, and what risks and potentials fanfic authors see in a possible Mulder and Krycek relationship. But in the words of one triple agent assassin, all in good time. I was originally going to write a shorter history lesson on the development of this ship, one where we would talk about some of the more notable events, stories, and fan creators. Instead, we ended up covering some of the heavier themes in the MKR fanfiction and fandom culture in general. I, for one, think it's a good thing to address and explore the more problematic and hefty elements in the ship before we can move on to the more fun and odd ones. This episode would not have been possible without my friend and fellow X-Files podcaster Shauna O'Boyle, who has taken the time to read the script and provide insightful feedback. Also, all the people behind the Internet Archive and Wayback Machine, without whom I would have no access to the old fan sites and archives, and Jedrzak M. Duzinski, whose thesis on NKR has provided a lot of the foundation for this episode. You can find all the sources I have used for this episode, as well as some recommended reading, in the description and in the Google Master Doc. This episode took me roughly 2 months to make. Working on it was pure joy, sprinkled with some anxiety, imposter syndrome, and dear God, don't let David Duchovny and Nicholas Lee find it syndrome. But despite all the negative emotions that usually come with the writing process, I can't remember the last time I had this much fun working on a creative project. And this podcast episode will be available as an essay on my Substack. Join me next month for a very different episode. And as I have said in the beginning of this one, no part of this episode may be used to train so-called AI models. And if I find out that you have been using my work without my permission to feed your energy-sucking plagiarism machines, I will personally send Alex Krycek to sort you out. As for the rest of you, I want to thank you for listening to this episode and for indulging me in my little joys of talking about my favorite ship. I hope that you found this episode interesting and informative, maybe even inspiring. I wish you the very best. Whatever it is that you're going to do, I wish you luck with that. And I will see you in April. I think I'm going to work on my novel now. Okay, bye.